Okay, a very good evening to all of you. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to have Professor Varghese speak to us this evening. Whenever I've listened to him, his breadth and depth of knowledge in higher education is so profound that there's just an endless amount of stuff to learn from him. He's currently Vice Chancellor of the National Institute of Educational Planning and Administration, NIPA, in New Delhi. He holds a doctoral degree in economics with specialization in educational planning. He was a founding director of the Center for Policy Research in Higher Education at NIPA, New Delhi from 2013 to 19. And many of you may be aware that the annual volumes which the CPRHE has brought out has been an extremely valuable resource in our understanding of higher education, the varied aspects of it in the country. He was head of governance and management in education at the International Institute for Educational Planning, Paris. This is a UNESCO organization from 2006 to 13, head of his training and education programs at IIEP Paris from 2001 to 6, and head of higher education and specialized training at Paris IEP Paris from 1999 to 2001. He was responsible for designing and introducing the IIEP Master's Program in Education Planning and Management. And while at IIEP, he was the Secretary General and responsible for the Secretariat of the International Working Group on Education, which is a network of funding agencies in education. In 1990s, he was professor and head of education planning at NIPA, New Delhi. He was responsible for managing an Asian regional network, the Asian Network of Training and Research Institutions in Education Planning, ANTRE, and was editor of his newsletter. He has published extremely extensively in both journals and books, and he's really been an inspiration in terms of our understanding of higher education in this country. So thank you very much for making the time to speak to us this evening. And if you wish, you can take questions in the middle or in the end, whatever you prefer, Mr. Varghese. I hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Sakya. It is indeed my pleasure and a privilege to talk to all the intellectuals, also are assembled, who are sitting to the other side of the table, are also equally well-versed in the area as much as I am. I'm extremely happy also to see that my colleague, my former colleague and friend, friend for all time, I cannot say that my former friend, Dr. Malish is here because that is specifically important, because what I am going to talk is an area which is nurtured by Dr. Malish and also another colleague of mine, Dr. Nidhi, in the CPRHE, So many of the largest empirical studies in these areas were conducted by them, although I have also contributed marginally to the area. Good night. Okay, so that is what I mean to say. Sakya sir, I can take around 35 to 40 minutes. Then you can have 10-15 minutes for question and answer interactions.
That's fine. You can take a bit more if you wish.
Okay.
That's fine.
Okay, all right. You tell me if I am exceeding the time. You show me your hand. I will know. I'll take only 5 minutes after you show your hand. Okay. So just to give me time to. Friends, it is important to see that when we discuss about development, when we discuss about changes that are brought out in society, when we talk about the directions of change that is taking place in society, it is important whether we are moving equally or we are moving to an egalitarian society or we are moving to a society which is divided by inequalities of several kinds. It need not have to be confined to economic inequality. It can be social inequalities, educational inequalities, and the different forms of inequalities. So education has an important role in terms of inequalities, either to create inequalities or converge societies more in terms of equality. And this role is performed by education in two ways. One, its role in production, other, its role in distribution. When I say this, in terms of its role in production, today when we talk about the knowledge society, and when you talk about knowledge as the most important input for production processes, especially in the technology-mediated process of development, but you are talking about the role of the knowledge produced by the universities, the knowledge that is produced by the research and development departments or research and development activities of institutions of higher education. This is a paramount role that it has played. And from data from 1973 to 2008, analyzed systematically by OECD countries, for all the developed countries, have come out with a conclusion in the regression analysis that higher education is the single most important variable in explaining variations in development, variations in economic growth and development. That is very important. So therefore, this has cemented the idea that, the role of higher education in development, the role of knowledge in development, the knowledge of R&D activities in general. Previously, in the 1960s and 70s, when education was talked about in the context of national development, we were talking more in terms of contribution of primary education to national development and economic growth, because at that point of time, primary education was not universalized. Primary education was also limited to some people, only especially in the less developed countries. But that situation has changed dramatically. So therefore, my first point is that the research studies have clearly indicated the unquestionable role of higher education in economic growth and development. And this has been done both in the developed countries and in the developing countries. The second dimension is that today, if 50 years ago, it is the landed properties and inheritance which decided your wealth capacity and your income. Today, a larger share of your income is decided by the earnings that you make from professions. And this makes a second dramatic change in terms of the role of higher education in development, because how the jobs are distributed, how the professions are distributed, and what is your earning and how is your wages. And it is found that in general, I am not talking about all instances, there may be exceptions, but I do not want to make generalizations based on exceptions. In general, what one finds is that the levels of wages, I will show you transparency I will tell you the exact figures at a later stage. In terms of wages that are somebody is getting, salaries one is getting, it is positively related to the levels of development, levels of education. That means somebody who is primary educated get less money than somebody who is secondary level educated, and somebody who is secondary level educated gets less money than somebody who is university educated. So this is the role in terms of distribution. So why I am making this point is that today inequalities are decided on the basis of these factors, and how jobs are distributed, how income is distributed, how earnings are distributed, and also how much you produce. That is decided on the basis of R&D activities, and education plays an important role in both cases. So important point is that the slogan used to be that we are growing slow, but we are growing equally. This was the Indian slogan in the 1960s and 70s. But today, the global slogan is that we are growing, but we are growing unequal. This is true in the developed countries, and also this is true in the developing countries. In most of the countries, except the Nordic countries or Scandinavian countries, this factor is true. And that is the way we see that the role of higher education in the process of development. I would like to deviate for a moment to dilate on the issues of equity in general more closely than coming to the higher education and equity. There are two dimensions that I would like to discuss. One, inequalities in higher education. Secondly, how higher education contributes to inequalities. That is, these are two different ways of looking at it. And I feel that unequal access to higher education and unequal success in higher education are the two important factors that contribute to perpetuating of inequalities from generation to generation. That is very important. What is important is also to decide, social trust is a necessary condition for success of any democracy. And how do we develop social trust is a major challenge, not only for education, but for the whole society and for the whole development. What one finds is that more equal societies have higher social trust. So if you go to Scandinavian countries, if you go to Sweden, if you go to Finland, if you go to Norway, if you go to Denmark and all these countries, you find that trust is very high. A regression analysis recently shows that, R-square is 0.39 in case of these countries, whereas it is much lower in case of developing countries. So I repeat what I said, that more equal societies have higher social trust. but I will not read the other way around. Social trust is responsible for creating equalities or inequalities. But in higher, equal societies have more social trust. Similarly, what we also find is that societies with a higher social trust have universal welfare program. This is very important. Universal welfare program. Why it is universal welfare program? Because you have social trust, and therefore we need not have to worry about it. Another trend that we find very consciously is in many countries is that within group trust is high, whereas between group trust is reducing. It's a very important phenomenon in development that we find that within group trust is increasing, which means that you'll find that if you're talking about, if you're creating a political party based on caste, you believe in that, you have trust within that. At the same time, when you talk about the national trust, there is social trust that is emerging, it is not happening. And therefore, social programs focusing on social welfare and general welfare cannot take deep roots in these cases. One of the reasons for right reasons, especially for the backward and disadvantaged groups, it is important to see that this trust, within group trust, is one of the basis for which political parties are attracted to focus on target group oriented programs in many cases. It is very important. So higher economic inequality results in social trust. If you take South Africa, is one of the very good examples. You find that it's a developing country, not a fully developed country, but you find that the inequalities are wider. If you take Zimbabwe, you will find that this is also a country with high levels of inequality. And if you take countries in South Asia, also you find that inequalities are high and social trust is very low. I'm not talking speculating. I am talking this based on some of the empirical studies that are already carried out. So unequal societies have high within group trust, but low social trust. So the question is that how do we promote democracy? When you talk about promoting democracy and democratic attitude and democratic principles, it becomes very important that the social trust is maximized rather than within group trust. Within group trust, how do we move from within group trust to social trust and generalized trust? That is an important question. That is why in some of the countries, there are no target group orientation for disadvantaged groups, because they believe that everybody should progress equally. And there are instances in many countries. I don't have much time to get into that general principle. So essentially, let me say that there is a need to develop social trust. And unfortunately, societies which are very unequal, the social trust is low. And societies which are more equal have more social trust, and societies which are having more social trust are also more democratic societies. I'm not talking about electoral democracy. I'm talking about democracy in terms of economic and social realms. So that is the important point that I would like to say that. So inequalities have become one of the most important dimensions of development everywhere when you're talking about. If you look at the COVID period, a phenomenon that you find in India is that poverty was increasing, people were thrown to poverty, and in a food crisis and many other crises that you have seen, but at the same time, the number of billionaires were increasing. A phenomenon that you find a very important phenomenon, because in 2021, at the peak of the COVID period, what we find is that the billionaire increased in 1 year from 102 to 143. That means 41 new billionaires emerged during the period of COVID period. So you find that low growth, negative growth, but billionaires are going up. This is a phenomenon that we find, and this is also one of the reasons why people lose trust. So not only social trust, trust in the government. People lose trust in any of the economic activities, any of the economic programs that you're trying to say. That is why I was trying to link the questions of democracy, social trust, economic growth, and social welfare. So what you find is that unequal access to higher education is a source of unequal distribution of wealth and unequal facilities that one is getting, it is very important to see that, therefore, equity in access to higher education. I am not only talking about access, I will come to the success issues related to success, what happened to the students once they come to the institutions. But first one is that unequal access to higher education is an emerging source and a major source of inequalities in all fields. So when you talk about inequalities, it's also important to see that equity is concerned with fairness and social justice. That is something to be underlined. And equity implies a respect for diversity. I would like to underline that 2 times, respect for diversity. That is something that is missing. It is not a question of getting money. It is not a question of getting a good job. It is also a question of how do you behave yourself in a society. That is where the origins of trust becomes very, very important, And responding to diversity means everyone has a unique attribute that is to be valued. Everyone has a unique attribute, If there are 6 billion people in the world, 6 billion people are having 6 billion attributes, You do not find this type of variations in any other ways that we are talking about, If you take the animal kingdom, animals may be behaving more or less in the similar fashion, but human beings, they look differently and they behave differently. And this is a unique feature that we find, So therefore, how do we try to, how do we value each attribute, each trait of a human being? That also comes from our respect for diversity, That is very important. Equity and inclusion are ideas emboldened in all democratic principles, which I mentioned. And democracy is an ideology, but as an ideology, everybody accepts it. But very few people can practice democracy. That is one quality with the democracy. Unless autocracy, you can preach autocracy and also you can practice autocracy. But unfortunately, democracy is a very desirable concept to speak and very undesirable, within inverted commas, undesirable concept to practice. So we all want to preach democracy, but at the same time, I want to protect my privilege. So far as democracy is all right for me, so far as my privileges remain untouched. So the question of privilege versus democracy becomes very important. And education is also a means to get privilege. And that is how sometimes education contributes to some of the undesirable factors, But I want to make a distinction between when you talk about equality or when you talk about inequalities, etc. Intergenerational inequality, if you take, one dimension that is to be done is that the property, wealth, etc. assets can create inequality. But if you remove the assets in one stage, you can also remove inequalities or make a pauper. A person who is rich can be made a pauper. But in case of education, the problem is that if you invest in education of any person, you cannot take it back. So there is a trap. And this is a trap because education contributes to durable inequalities much more than other forms of asset. And if you give, so one of the reasons for resistance to spread education to the poor people, spread education to the disadvantaged group, is that unlike other attributes or unlike other asset distribution, we cannot take back once we give education to the people. The skills that you try to develop and skills that you try to promote cannot be taken back, So that is where the issues of, if you look into higher education and access to higher education, previously it was what is called as an inherited merit, That was the argument for providing, facilitating higher education, access, deciding, influencing, determining access to higher education. Then we had a stage when we talk about equality of rights, which reduced the barriers to entry. Then we are talking about equality of opportunities, which is avoiding social exclusion, avoiding marginalization process in terms of access to higher education. This becomes important. And if you see the forms in which inequalities are perpetuated, what you find is that if you look into the developed countries in Europe or America, race is one of the important dimensions which decides, influences, and determines inequalities. in social inequalities, not only economic inequalities, but social inequalities. But if you come to Asian societies, exclusion in Asian societies is more based on ethnicity. You may be belonging to the same religion, but ethnicity is different. In certain cases, it is a regional one. But in India, if you say that main basis of exclusion in India are caste, religion, gender, region, and economic, economic status. These are the four ways, because in the subsequent empirical analysis that I'll be presenting or I'll be talking about, I want to get into these different dimensions of inequalities, especially in education. So when we talk about inclusive growth, it includes affirmative policies, targeting the poor, marginalized, and the disadvantaged. There is a term called progressive universalism. This is something Gordon Brown talked about when one is talking about the development of education in the new era for the new world. How do we facilitate progressive universalism? How do we transform the world into one? We cannot be equal opportunity or equal avenues for development. In that sense, equality does not exist. If equality, everything that is distributed equally, the facilities, that will lead to unequal outcomes. What we need is not equality. What we need is equity in terms of the inputs, equity in terms of the processes, so that we can talk about equality in terms of the outcome. So I want to underline this factor, which I strongly believe that, so we need not have to talk about equality in inputs. And my feeling is that equality in inputs can lead to unequal outcomes. So where do you want to have equality and where do you want to have equity is an important dimension that needs to be happening. If you take the higher education field, there are three types of situations in higher education. When the expansion is accompanied by increase in inequality indexes, you'll find that we are more in the mode of inherited merit of access to higher education. That means the rich is getting benefited more than the poor and the disadvantaged. When the expansion is accompanied by no change in or increase in the inequality indicators, we find that the rich and poor benefit, the relative positions remain more or less the same. But when expansion is accompanied by a reduction in the indicators of inequality, that is the stage where you find that expansion takes place and that is benefiting the poor. At a later stage, I will come to see that this is the process of catch-up that we talk about in social sciences. This is a process of catch-up that we talk about in social progress that we are talking about. So unequal rates of progress under the targeted policies lead to more equality. That means how do we reach equality? Which means that those people who are lagging behind, those people who belong to the disadvantaged group, they should grow at a faster rate than those people who belong to the general category. So it is not that any group is not growing, other group is growing. That is not true. It is the rate, varying rate at which the groups grow, that decides the path towards equality, that decides the path to equality in the real sense of the term. What is important is that in 20th century, we were talking about education in general and higher education in particular, but that was a public sector dominated higher education. This century, we are talking about higher education, which is a market mediated higher education. I think the dramatic change that has taken place in the last 50 years or 60 years in our country is that we have moved from a public policy decided, a public funded, a public institution centered higher education to a more private sector, private centered or market centered higher education system. And I should say that this also has contributed to higher growth rates of higher education, faster expansion of the sector. And we reached a stage what is sometimes referred to as the massification of higher education, which is a stage where higher education expansion is beyond 50% of the gross enrollment ratio. Gross enrollment ratio means the share of youth or higher education, it is youth belonging to the age group of 18 to 22 or 23, who are in the schools, sorry, who are in the colleges and in the universities and institutions, other institutions of higher education or post-secondary education. So what happens is that this century experienced a very fast and accelerated growth of higher education. The first 50 years of our planned development from 1951 to 2000, what we experienced is a slow growth and low GER. But what we found from this century is that a fast growth and the trebling of, more than trebling of GER and more than 4.5 times increase in higher education. Today we have a sector, higher education sector, just more than 38 million students and a gross enrollment ratio of 27.1% or 27.2%. You know, this is a dramatic jump that you have seen in this century, and this is also partly, not partly, substantially contributed by the private sector. And we'll find that today private sector has around 78% of the institutions, both aided and unaided sector together, and we have more than roughly around 60 to 66% of the enrollment is also in the private institution. So we have dramatically changed the growth in higher education, mostly in terms of the change that we see in terms of from public sector dominated growth to a private sector dominated growth, from a state funded arrangement to a market oriented arrangement. How did this affect the progress of education in the past 20 years or 25 years, perhaps more than that? I will say that the change that you find is substantial. If you take these 4 dimensions of inequalities in higher education that I talked about, the regional inequalities, the inequalities between gender, the social group inequalities, and if you consider these inequalities, how did inequalities change? Let me first say some positive change that has taken place. The positive change is that gender inequalities are narrowing down in India. Or in other words, now you have a GER, gross enrollment ratio, higher for girls than for boys. And you find that's an interesting trend, which I noticed earlier, which I am repeating again, is a trend that we find that in most of the cases, when the gross enrollment ratio in higher education is around 25 to 30% or 35%, you find that the gender parity index is in favor of girls, in favor of women, or in favor of females. Whereas in school education, even when the gross enrollment ratio is 80%, we find that this is not the case. The girls lag behind boys. Here in India, we find that the gender parity index in general for all India is more than 1, which means that the GR is more than the boys' GR so far as the gender part is concerned. And if you go to some of the states like Kerala, which has the highest gender parity index, you know, of 1.32, which means that that the GR is much higher among girls, and there are more girls in the colleges than boys in Kerala. So that is the case. What we find is in terms of the gender issues. If you come to other dimensions, social dimensions, what we find is that there is a lot of change that we find in terms of the social disadvantages, you know, how the trends in social disadvantages are also very interesting to notice. If you go by gender GER, you will find that there is substantial differences between, because the general category is very high, and this is followed by the scheduled OBC category, and this is followed by SC, scheduled caste category, and the least GR is among the scheduled tribe. But if you take the changes that are made, the faster changes, as I was talking about, the rate of change or rate of progress or rate of growth that has taken place, we certainly find that these changes are substantial when it comes to the issues related to the social changes. And what is the change that we find? If you find that the change that is happening is that the gains in GR are lower for ST and still better for SC, and the best is for OBC. And OBC surpasses in terms of the gains, not the total, the gains when compared with the general category people. And another way of looking at this inequality is that of the total students who are enrolled in higher education sector in India, we can see that how they have contributed. What one finds is that of the total students in higher education, if you take 1 decade ago, in 2010-11, we find that 57% of the total students in higher education belong to the general category. And you find that 27% belong to the OBC, and 4% belong to the ST, and 11% belong to the SC. Now, if you see in 1920, what we find is that the share of general category has declined from 58% to 47 to 48%. There's a sharp decline of 10 percentage points in the past 10 years for the share of general category. I am not saying that the total number of students came down. Please do not misunderstand me. I'm talking about the share, and that will explain how the composition of student composition is changing in the country. And if you see the OBC category, you find that they have made from 27 to 37. That means 10 percentage points increase that is made by OBC. You will find that ST category could improve only marginally, a 2 percentage points from 4 to 6. And in SC category, you'll find that it is only from 11 to 14%. In other words, this explains the changing scenario in terms of the equity in distribution of access situations in the country. So if I repeat once again, without using the figures, what I mean to say is that OBCs have been catching up very fast. SCs are catching up rather slowly, and STs are catching up the least. And this catching up has changed the composition of the students. Today, what it means is that the students from the general category, non-reserved, non-disadvantaged category has become a minority in higher education. And this is a trend that we find from 2013-14. Or in other words, if I say that, if I put it differently, higher education has massified. And this massification has contributed to change in the composition, student composition of higher education. The student composition has also contributed to the social equality or inequality dimensions. If you see that inequalities, social inequalities continue to be high, but certain groups within the disadvantaged groups are moving faster, and they have taken advantage of this opportunity, both opened by the market forces and also provided by the state sector. Whereas those who relied more on the state sector, like the SCs and STs, they could not progress faster. Please do not misunderstand me. I am not saying that the state sector is not certainly that the state sector is an important dimension of targeting benefits in favor of the disadvantaged groups. I am not against that. But what is happening is that state sector is not expanding. The expanding sector is a private sector. And the expanding sector of the private sector is taken advantage by the OBCs and the general category people. And given the low base of the OBCs, they are moving faster. And as a result of that, we are moving towards equality, more equality, because it is only 5 percentage point difference between the OBCs and the general categories in 2020, the latest year for which latest year for which data are available, whereas it used to be more than 29 percentage points in 2010. Friends, this is an important change that is taking place in India, which needs to be underlined. You know, how within the social groups, the composition is changing. So let me repeat this point once again. From a 29% difference in enrollment in terms of the share of students enrolled by the different groups, especially OBC and non-OBC or non-SC, ST and OBC group, which is what we call as a general category, this gap has come down to around 5 to 6 percentage points. In other cases, these changes are not substantial. In other words, let me summarize this part by saying that inequalities, when you talk about this distribution of access facilities, have improved substantially, and is also partly because of the reservation policies that we have followed, and also because of the quota system that we have followed. And perhaps the group which has benefited maximum from this is the OBC category. Also because of the fact that many of them are economically advantaged groups. As a result of that, they could also afford private higher education, private universities, and private pay colleges, So that is something which is very important. And if you look into these social inequality by region and sex, what you find is that in the rural areas, the difference between, so for example, if you take SC, ST, the difference between the men and women in terms of enrollment in the rural areas is very high. So for example, in the ST community, you find that it is only half of the women share is coming to the colleges and universities as that of the ST men. When it comes to SC community, you find that there is a catch-up that is taking place, but slower. Whereas when it comes to OBC, this catch-up is faster. So let me make 2 points here. One, these differences are substantial among the social groups between sexes in the rural areas. And within the rural areas, these variations are substantial in case of ST and considerable in terms of SC, but less in terms of OBC and also for the general category. So we are moving in a direction, but the rate of change is substantially different, So that is very important to see that. But if you look into the urban areas, where you find that whether it is the social category SC, ST, OBC, or general category, what you find is that there is more equality. Or in other words, what I want to submit is that we need to focus more on the rural areas when we are talking about equality or sex between sexes by different social groups. So I am talking about intersectionality between the social groups and this. Then if you go by economic dimensions, what you find is that the lowest category, I told you about the billionaires growth, but if you go by the lowest income groups, the lowest 20%, we find that the enrollment rate at the lowest 20% is remaining more or less the same, not substantially different. And in the rural areas, it is much less. Whereas enrollment in higher education is dominated by those people who are in the fourth quintile, that means 60 to 80% or 80 to 100%, So higher education, even with the expansion, remains more as a system of a middle class and upper middle class phenomenon, not a lower middle class phenomenon. That is an important change that we are talking about, which is very important. So friends, the inequalities in development in this also contributes to employment. Let me shift within my next 5 minutes, sir. So within 5 minutes, let me take 5 more minutes to shift to employment. If you look into the employment scene, which decides about the distribution, what you find is that there is a positive association between education and levels of jobs, levels of wages. So, for example, the latest study of the NSS 2017 and the National Family data shows that if you are an illiterate, your annual income average is 7,300 plus. But if you are a higher secondary, it becomes 25,000. And if you are an undergraduate, it is around 27,000. And if you are a postgraduate, you get around 32,000, 33,000. So you can see on average, the level of income or level of earnings will be the right word to use. You find that with the higher education increase and higher education development, this trend is changing. So there are disparities, but these disparities are also making a dramatic change. One disparity which I did not touch is the regional disparity. You find that States like Telangana, Pondicherry or Puducherry or Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh have a higher concentration of higher education institutions. And for 1 lakh population, you find that 53 institutions or 59 institutions in Karnataka, whereas you find that it is only 7 institutions in Bihar, Jharkhand, West Bengal, etc. So what you find is that most of the private sector growth is in these institutions, where you find that higher education institutional growth is also higher. So private higher education, share of private higher education and regional concentration of higher education institutions go together. And this is a trend that we find, and that also contributes substantially to the changes that you are talking about. I will take one more dimension, sir, that is English as the medium of instruction. But we also find is that once the share of private sector is increasing, and once the private unaided sector is increasing, you find that at least in the school sector, 72% of the students in the private unaided schools are following English medium, whereas it is only 34% in case of the government schools. So you find different pathways of growth for the students who are going to the private higher education, private schools and their entry to higher education, and government schools and their entry to higher education institutions. I can go on talking about all these things much more elaborately, but time does not permit me. But let me just say that in the new education, issue of equity is addressed, how the issue of equity is to be resolved. New education policy envisages a move from massification of higher education to universalization of higher education, which means the gross enrollment ratio will be 50%, which means that a doubling of gross enrollment ratio from 26% to when the policy was formulated to around 50% by the year 2035. And we made a rough estimate, it means around 72 million students. Now we have around 38 million students. You can see the change that is taking place, and you can imagine about the size of the sector growth that is taking place. The country will continue to rely on market to expand higher education sector. That is a message, although it is not mentioned like the way that I am putting forward. That is the message that you are getting, which means that it is not through the public sector investment. And if you see that the first budget that came out in 2021, after the new education policy, there was a decline in the public investment budgetary allocation by the central government in the education sector, and higher education lost by around 6,000 crores. The focus will be shifted to the SCDGs. And that is something important dimension that the policy is talking about. Socially and educationally deprived groups, or disadvantaged groups will be getting focus. And a new term that is coming up is becoming very important is that SCZ. And what you find is that zones, educational zones, specialized or special education zones will be developed, and they'll be targeted for additional funding and making the dimensions that are talking about. Another change that is finding is that those people who are coming from the rural areas, who are studying in the government schools, who followed regional languages, they find it very difficult to cope with the curriculum and cope with the language challenges in the universities where it is English is medium of instruction. And what is the policy also talks about developing bridge courses, compensatory education. UGC had a scheme. I think Dr. Malish was leading a research on the impact of these schemes started by UGC long back. What we found was that in his study, what we found was that this has substantially contributed. The program may not be fully successful, but they had contributed to the benefit of the disadvantaged groups getting or taking advantage of the academic advantage of these things. So that is something that is important. And also increased student support system. A new trend that we find in terms of financing is that there's a targeted student support systems that are developing in terms of fellowship. While institutional financing is declining, student support financing continues to grow, and that's a very positive change that we are talking about. So However, there are certain other issues related to new education policy. When we are talking about what is happening is also that the policy of institutional consolidation, when it says that at least there should be 3,000 students in a higher education institution, which means that these institutions, many of the institutions established in the local, remote rural area, where rural people and people from the disadvantaged groups were taking advantage, their future is questioned. So how this will unravel itself in the real policy implementation needs to be seen. So I would like to wind up within the next 2 minutes. The questions are how to address inequalities in access to higher education. The answer perhaps is he said in the new education policy, or what is to be generally called globally is the progressive universalism. That is the one we need to focus on. How to address inequalities in success in higher education. That is the place where we should know how to address student diversity in the classrooms and in the campuses, and therefore a student support system, not financial support, an academic support system that needs to be developed. The institutional mechanisms which are existing, there are cells which are existing that needs to be strengthened, and new programs needs to be initiated to strengthen that. And I think that how to promote academic integration and develop inclusive campuses, that becomes a major concern. Or in other words, if I put that, the major change that is taking place in higher education is massification and change to universalization. This results into diversity of different forms, and student diversity is an important dimension. How to address student diversity, we do not know. The institutional arrangements and the teachers' attitude were not always in favor of addressing the issues of diversity. So that makes a lot of difference. Certainly, there is no doubt that our quota systems and reservation policies have contributed substantially to bring children and bring students to the colleges and expand this across the social groups. But that is not sufficient. If you stop there, we are trying to waking up the sleeping children to tell them that we do not have dinner. I think we should have permitted them to sleep, or we should have given them dinner. If they were invited to come to the classes, we should provide them quality education. That remains the challenge today. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Professor Varghese, for an extremely thought-provoking presentation, starting from building social trust to the different forms, issues of higher education, which you highlighted. We leave it open to the floor right now for anybody who wishes to ask a question.
Sir, when they are asking the question, please request them to introduce.
Professor P.S. Kamble from Kolhapur, Maharashtra. I want to ask. Sir, are you listening to me?
Yes, yes, I can hear you, sir.
Sir, you have placed before number of dimensions of inequalities, especially after 95 onwards, privatization is increasing, and consequently exclusion is increasing across the social groups as well as rural and urban areas. In the context of national education policy, will it increase significantly? Exclusion of across the social groups as well as rural, urban, and male, female as well. And supplementary to that, whether the role of the government in higher education development, what is expected and desirable, which is included in the national education policy or not. And one more question, sir. Just I want to speak. If inequalities are growing, whether benefits and fruits of growth will be reached to across the social groups and rural, urban, and male, female as well. That is what. Thank you very much, sir.
Sakya Sahab, should I respond to the question now?
I think you can actually, because yeah.
Okay, so let me say the following. The first one is that the NEP, what it is trying to do. NEP is following two paths. On the one side, it says that there will be specific programs for SEDGs, socially and economically disadvantaged groups, targeted group orientation. Then it says that a new concept that is coming is that we will be having SEZ, special education zones, which means that we'll be moving from the district level to the block level arrangements, and we'll be identifying the blocks which has larger number of disadvantaged groups, and focus will be given. So this is an equity argument that we are trying to provide. But at the same time, as I mentioned, there is an idea of institutional consolidation. It says that all the institutions should have minimum of 3,000 students. Now, if you look into the empirical reality today in India, there are only, out of 42,000 colleges existing in India, there are only 4% of the colleges have more enrollment than 3,000. You have another 4% of the colleges which have enrollment between 2,000 to 3,000, which means that 92% of the colleges in India at present have only 2,000, less than 2,000 enrollment. It is very difficult to envisage that these colleges can have more than or equal to 3,000 enrollment. With the institutional consolidation, if it means that closing down of institutions, because when these small institutions, there are more than 2,600 colleges in India where the enrollment is less than 500. And you find that monodisciplinary institutions are very common. And if you look into 1995 decision of the NCT, National Council for Teacher Education, they wanted the teacher education centers, when they introduced a five-year teacher education, they wanted this to be a separate institution within the university campus or outside. So these are not language, monocurriculum or mono-subject domains that are promoted. So what will happen to these institutions? So what I mean to say is that while policy is focusing and targeting on the SCs, which is a very positive sign in favor of the disadvantaged groups, I feel that personally, this is my personal opinion, I feel that given the empirical reality of the distribution of the colleges and the size, the institutional consolidation may not be supportive of what it is mentioned in terms of the SCs, especially for higher education. The second, the role of the government. Role of the government has to change. What I feel is that over a period of time, this has not changed. What is happening is that today we get, in 1950s, we used to get more funding from UGC, more funding from the government. Today we get more advisors and less funding. We have we had a colleague, or we had a person, Dr. Iyer, who was the secretary. So once he was invited for a meeting here in NIPA. So he made a statement that today we get only advisors and not money. So advisors has replaced money. So, but that does not mean that. So this is an important dimension of change in role of the government. But my feeling is that, my experience and my personal opinion is that we cannot rely on expansion of higher education relying entirely on the public money. The public money will not expand. Even after NEP, the budgetary allocations, this year there was a little more increase in the budgetary allocation, but that was not the case in the first year. So what I need to say is that we had to redesign, recalibrate the role of state. The state limited funding it should be target oriented, focused more on to the disadvantaged groups, and not to take advantage by the advanced groups or economically and financially well-to-do families. So we need to have a target system, target mechanism like that. The second dimension is that the state should take initiative to design new framework for action, whether it is a private sector or the government sector. So at one point of time, the private sector is arguing for we should get all the benefits like the public sector. Yes, they should be given all the benefits like the private sector. But at the same time, there should be a way in which the rules and regulations are very clearly defined to make private sector more socially acceptable or with more social responsibility. So, sir, I will say 3 points that I am saying. The state has an important role, but at the same time, the state will not be able to resolve the financial issues. The way that we used to look at the state as the main funder of higher education needs to be changed. That does not mean that the state will be playing a less important role. Its role will be shifted from main financier to the regulator, to provide a framework for operation so that autonomy is granted. And what I am also saying as a third point is that whatever state funding is there, that should be directed towards the disadvantaged groups, both economically disadvantaged and socially disadvantaged. And that is the way we'll be in a position to see. And you're talking about inequalities, the third question that you asked, these inequalities are reflected not only in education. However, educational inequalities are a basic reason for inequalities in jobs and inequalities in status and inequalities in earnings, So unless we correct the educational inequalities, not through enrolling students, but through providing comparable quality education, we will not be able to address the issues of inequality in society, not in education sector, unless we correct it at the education sector. Thank you very much. I hope I am trying to answer.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Professor Alkendra Singh has a question. You have your hands raised. You can unmute and ask.
So thank you very much, sir, for the wonderful talk. I am Alkendra Singh. I am in Department of Physics, Banaras University, Varanasi. So it appears that the private sector has a lot to contribute in the higher education. And already, I think from 92 onwards, there are already so many private institutions that have surfaced up in the Indian context. But in my opinion, there is a serious issue of quality when it comes to the private universities, although there are wonderful universities that have come in the recent past. So what is your opinion? I mean, what is the future when we talk about the role of private universities in the context of higher education, as well as the quality in the context, also in the context of NEP 2020? Thank you so much.
See, sir, this is Dr. Singh, Dr. Alkendra Singh. Am I right?
Yeah.
So, sir, what I feel is that when private sector was a small sector, they were doing well. Everybody wanted to get in the private sector. The school sector is a very good example. Most of the schooling facilities and enrollment were catered to by the aided sector or the government sector, and unaided sector was very limited in enrollment. They were doing well. But when the private sector expanded in higher education, what is happening is that quality is a big question mark. And if you take, say, for example, professional education, where private sector has expanded maximum. If you take engineering education, the largest expansion that has taken place in the professional education is in engineering education. Nearly 40% of the enrollment in professional education is in the engineering education. What you find now, many colleges are getting closed down. If you go to Tamil Nadu, many of the engineering colleges are closing down. Why? The graduates are not in a position to get any employment. Why they are not in a position to get employment? First is the employment generation issue, but second one is that the quality of education that is provided is very poor. So to answer your question, what you are finding is that there are some institutions in the private sector, like in the public sector, IITs and IIMs, etc., or Jawaharlal Nehru universities or Banaras universities, or you find that Hyderabad universities, central universities, etc. There are some isolated instances of excellence that is being created in the private sector. But the overall contribution of private sector is no doubt by declining quality of education, as I mentioned in engineering and other cases. In general education also, this is happening. Let me also add one dimension since you asked this question. In the coming years, there will be a competition between the foreign universities which will be coming and starting branch campuses in India. India did not permit branch campuses of foreign universities to come and operate here. But what we find now is that they will be coming as a result of the new policy change. They will be opening institutions. So the competition will be elite private institutions will be competing with the elite foreign established institutions, and there will be an elite group of institutions that will be developing. Indian Institutes of Technology, ISER, you find IIM institutes of management, then top ranking private institutions, and these branch campuses. They form if I can use in the caste hierarchy, the Brahminical hierarchy of the new higher education that will be emerging in the coming ages. I'm sorry for using a caste name. It is not with any aspersion. I'm just trying to say that they'll be at the top of the quality dimension that you are talking about. But I don't think that the overall quality improvement will take place unless we make serious efforts to change the institutional culture. Say, for example, although we established accreditation agencies in 1994, as of today, only 1/3 of the universities and less than 20% of the colleges are accredited. It is not because accreditation agencies are not there. Institutions are also not willing to go for accreditation because they do not find any advantage of going for accreditation, or they do not find any disadvantage of not going for accreditation. That is the way I see higher education in the coming years.
I'm Indrani Datta from Guwahati.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for your very informative lecture. But I'm still worried, even if you have said that, the state has a role to play so far as, looking after the regulatory aspects and also looking at the more of the social equity and all those things. But I still believe, and I'm still worried. Indeed, I'm very worried about if privatization increases, it will definitely increase the quality that you talk of. So, I mean, I don't see a, kind of very rosy picture of inequality being reduced through higher education. So that's it. Yes.
Finished?
Yes, sure.
Madam, I did not say inequalities will be declining. I never said that. we are growing unequal. That becomes a slogan. And with the market orientation, if it is not regulated systematically, this will happen. When I made about the state, what I talked about is that the state should invest increasingly in a targeted way. That means their resources, public resources, should go to the disadvantaged groups. That is one thing that I mentioned. Secondly, the state should regulate the fees that can be levied and many other things that can be done by the private sector, not to make them close down. They should also get, because they have to pay the salaries of the teachers and many other things have to be maintained. So I'm not talking about a system whereby the state squeezes the private sector, but there should be a socially responsible private sector that needs to be developed. That is very important. Otherwise, we will not be able to see that the higher education will be expanding and reducing inequalities. I am not talking about eliminating inequalities. That is required. So the state role is not only to prepare rules and regulations, it's also important to see that the available resources are targeted. But the point that I am trying to say is that I can make a public speech by saying that the state should invest. There is an argument that the state should invest 6%. 1968 policy, we said that the state should invest in education at least 6% of the GDP. This is 52 years have gone, more than half a century gone. We have not reached that target. Even now, we are hovering around 4% of the GDP. Now, my point is that even if the state increases from 4% to 6%, this will not resolve the financial issues or funding issues in education. So when I say that we have reached a stage where we will not be able to see that the state will be giving funds, So there is no point in saying that state should invest, state should invest. Our past experience in the last 50 years, half a century, has shown that state has not invested. We can attribute motives to the state, but the reality is that, empirical reality is that state has not expanded. So I do not want to make a polemical statement by saying that the state should invest, that is the route, which I feel that it will not work out.
Thank you, Professor Varghese. Vijay, you had a question?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Varghese. But you see, I think you have, if you can hear me, you have actually answered part of the question. But I would like to highlight this particular point, that when we look at access and equity, we kind of raise questions which are primarily utilitarian. I mean, utilitarian in nature. In so far as our wish for what you call progressive universalism is absolutely there and it is in place. But then when we create apparatuses that would create equity and quality, I think we find that these are hugely competitive. And no, the government is more interested in regulating rather than investing. You're right that the government will not invest. But the government brings in regulations which are getting exponentially restrictive, but then it is also gradually withdrawing funding. So the private sector comes in that is not interested in investing in quality, it is interested in investing. And why would the private sector put in a lot of money, millions of rupees, for instance, if it does not get profit? We want to leave our social welfare schemes to the private sector in education, or do we want to really, look back at wealth production and human resources development? I have a problem because you see the government talks about education, progress, and wealth production, but then doesn't want to put in money there. You see, it stays, as you said, at 4%. We had been talking about 6% for the last many, many years. So there is a fundamental difference, or there is a fundamental contradiction in looking for quality and looking for equity or equality. We cannot do both unless we put in a lot of money. And then unless we get right answers regarding where the money comes from, we will only be talking. See, I think I appreciate the point you made, but then how would we then invest in quality? Because if there is no money, we cannot invest in quality. So that is what I actually know. But then you have partly answered my question. So if you wish, maybe you can maybe say.
No, sir, what you are making, the point that you are making is absolutely right. I was just trying to see that a realistic picture rather than a picture which is maybe just a romantic picture of growth of higher education or future of higher education. I was just trying to make a more a picture which is more realistic. What I feel is that if I say that state should invest 6%, it will not happen. I know it. It will not happen. 50 years, it does not happen. As you rightly pointed out, I also pointed out it will not happen. So I can say that the only solution is state should invest 10%, but we know that it will not happen. So what I am saying is that essentially we find a shift. That is why I started by saying that the change that is taking place is from a state determined model to a market-oriented, market-mediated model that is taking place. The question is that how do we protect the disadvantaged? When people are growing, middle class is growing and upper middle class is growing, it does not affect them. They survive even without state funding. So that is acceptable. But unless we have the other groups who are economically and socially disadvantaged, we'll find it very difficult. So that is what I was talking about more in terms. I started my discourse by focusing on trust, not on education. So that is the trust that you have to develop in government, in governance, both. That can come only when people feel that the state is more equitous, state is behaving more in terms of equality, not only in terms of the facilities that it creates or the amount of money that it invests, but also in terms of the policies that it subscribes, not only for the public institution, but also for the private institution. So when we talk policy, it talks about light but tight, the rules and regulations, So we have to look at that, So I am not somebody who says that the private sector should be, or the institution should be closed down. That is not an answer. Then instead of 38 million students getting enrolled, we may remain with 10 million or 20 million students, So we have to make a balance between what is the expansion that is possible. Should we deny our students an admission to these places? If you have the capacity to pay, you go to the private sector. If you do not have the capacity to pay, either you be admitted to the private sector and let the government target the financing, or you go to the government sector. But I also do not believe in a situation whereby all the government schools are only meant for the disadvantaged groups. The socialization process will be different. That is also not a good situation. So that is what I am saying, that, I cannot envisage a situation whereby the role of the private sector is declining over a period of time. It will remain the same or expand. That's the way, sir, I see the growth of private sector. I am not saying that this should be the way, but I am saying that this will be the way that the things will be unraveled. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Professor Varghese. Professor Varghese, you highlighted the importance of diversity and also mentioned about the changes which are taking place in terms of the percentages of OBC and general and the SC/ST as well. But in terms of having a diversity across ethnicities, languages, linguistic boundaries, particularly in state-supported institutions where there's a lot of pressure to take in just local faculty or local students, encourage diversity across the country is probably going to be quite a challenge, isn't it?
Yes, that is true. It's not really a big challenge. It's not only a challenge, sir. That is the biggest challenge. There is a revolution that is taking place in the higher education institutions today, which we are not internalizing. 66% of the students belong to the disadvantaged groups in the higher education institutions, and equal share of the teachers belong to privileged groups. And students remain there only for 3 years or 4 years. And this student body and the composition changes, and it is more towards diversity. But the teachers continue in the system for 35 years or 40 years in some cases. But the teachers do not change, not in terms of their competencies to teach, but in their compassion. If you are talking about empathy towards the social groups, that is not substantially changing. So that is the place where we need to have change. It is not only a question of investing money, but how you are managing a classroom, how you are managing a campus, that becomes very important. That is why I started by saying that, respect for diversity, respect for your individual traits, that becomes an important dimension. So we are not talking about race in India. We are talking about caste in India. We are talking about religion in India. We are talking about ethnicity in India. We are not talking in terms of the race issues like what we find in Europe and America. So that is the diversity that is taking place. And we need to change institutional culture, individual attitude, from sympathy to empathy. These are the changes which are essential in institutions of higher education if we want to change higher education, and if we want the disadvantaged groups to benefit, take advantage of the opportunities that are provided by the public system, and cope with and compete with the students coming from better socioeconomic background. Sir, that is what I feel. So diversity is the issue, is the emerging issue. Unless we address this issue squarely, enlarging inequalities or widening inequalities will be the result, and higher education will be playing a contributory role to widening of the intergenerational inequalities.
Thank you very much. There's so much to sort of think over and reflect on your talk today. Thanks very much.